Imagine the heartbreak of losing someone you love. Now, imagine the shock and surprise when months later, that person suddenly reappears, alive, as if nothing had happened. This is the story of Pedro, a young boy who was declared dead after a tragic accident, but who, inexplicably, returned without any memory of where he had been or how he survived. What happened to Pedro during those months of disappearance? And how could he have been declared dead, only to reappear without any explanation? But before we dive deeper into this unbelievable story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our mysterious stories. And if you've ever experienced something unexplainable or know someone who has, share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear about your experiences. It all began on a quiet afternoon. Pedro, a 17-year-old boy, was riding his bicycle home when he was struck by a car. The impact was brutal, and witnesses at the scene said that Pedro was thrown several meters into the air. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics couldn't detect any vital signs. Pedro's body was taken to the hospital, where doctors confirmed the boy's death. The news devastated his family, friends, and the entire community. The days that followed were filled with grief. Pedro had been known as a cheerful boy, full of life, with a bright future ahead of him. His family held a funeral, and everyone tried to cope with the sudden and tragic loss of someone so young. The pain was indescribable, and life went on, though with an unfillable void. About 3 months after the accident, something completely unbelievable happened. One ordinary morning, Pedro's mother, Marissa, heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, she couldn't believe her eyes. Pedro was standing there, alive, wearing the same clothes he had on the day of the accident. She fainted immediately, unable to process the sight before her. When she regained consciousness, Pedro was still there, confused and unsure of what was happening. His mother, still in shock, began asking him questions, but Pedro's answers were bewildering. He had no memory of the accident or the months he had been missing. To him, it was as if no time had passed at all. He remembered leaving the house on his bike, but nothing beyond that. He had no idea where he had been, how he had survived, or how he had ended up at his front door. The family rushed Pedro to the hospital for an examination. The doctors were stunned. The boy was perfectly healthy, with no signs of recent injury or trauma. His medical tests showed nothing out of the ordinary, but the most surprising part was that Pedro displayed no signs of physical deterioration, as someone who had supposedly been missing for months would. It was as if time hadn't touched him at all. As Pedro tried to resume his life, the mystery of his disappearance and inexplicable return spread quickly through the town. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. Pedro's friends, shocked by his return, asked questions, but Pedro had no answers. He simply couldn't remember anything after the moment of the accident. The community began to speculate. Some believed Pedro had been abducted by aliens, while others thought he might have experienced some sort of supernatural event. There were even those who believed it had all been a medical mistake and that Pedro had never truly died. However, these rumors couldn't explain the fact that Pedro's body had been identified at the hospital, his vital signs had been absent, and he had been buried after being declared dead. Theories became more and more absurd. Some claimed that Pedro had been brought back to life by a divine force, while others said he had been part of a secret government experiment. But no matter how many stories circulated, no one could understand what had really happened. Pedro himself, now a young man with a second chance at life, tried to move on, but he couldn't ignore the mystery surrounding him. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Local media, and eventually national outlets, covered the story, turning Pedro's case into a phenomenon. Scientists, journalists, and investigators tried to find explanations, but the mystery remained. No answer seemed sufficient. Meanwhile, Pedro began to notice something strange happening to him. Small details in his life started to feel out of place. He remembered friends and family, but there were small lapses that didn't make sense. People approached him, saying he had promised things he didn't remember saying. There were also moments when he had the eerie feeling that something was watching him, an invisible presence he couldn't explain. Pedro also started having disturbing dreams. He dreamed of places he had never visited, yet they felt strangely familiar. In his dreams, he saw bright lights, distant figures, and heard voices he didn't recognize, but they seemed to be trying to tell him something important. Every night, he woke up in a cold sweat, with the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The questions continued without answers. Where had Pedro been during those months? How had he survived? And why couldn't he remember anything? His family, while relieved to have him back, still lived with the uncertainty that something wasn't right. Pedro seemed to be the same boy they had lost, but there was a strangeness in his presence, as if he wasn't exactly the same as before. Over time, Pedro began to accept that he might never know what really happened to him. Life returned in part to normal, but the mystery of his disappearance continued to haunt him. He knew that something had happened, something beyond his comprehension, but there was no way to find out what it was. He was alive, but with an unexplainable emptiness inside him, as if a crucial part of his existence had been erased forever. Now it's your turn. What do you think happened to Pedro? Was it a medical failure? Something supernatural? Or is there another explanation for this mystery? Leave your theory in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more unexplained stories like this. Share this video with your friends and see if anyone can help solve the mystery of the boy who came back from the dead without explanation.